welcome to the stage our good buddy, Chad Bird.
Well, I was going to talk about the New Testament today, but after that introduction, I guess I better stick with the tried and true Old Testament. Before we get that far back, though, I want to talk about something that happened in 1976. So in 76, my dad and my granddad, Carson and Leroy Bird, traveled from Texas to Hopewell Village, Pennsylvania, for the celebration of our nation's bicentennial. And in a way, they were returning to their roots. You see, Hopewell Village was a small community, about 850 acres. It was what was called an iron plantation back then. It was established in the 1700s by a guy named Mark Bird, who is my great-great-great-great-grandfather. Hopewell Village is now a National Historic Site, primarily because Mark Bird was instrumental in helping out George Washington in the Revolutionary effort by giving them cannons as well as shipping flour to Washington and his men when they were at Valley Forge. Well, a few weeks ago, my wife Stacy and I were back visiting family, and I talked with my dad, who turns 80 this year. We talked about his visit to Hopewell Village about 45 years ago. He's got copies of letters that Mark Bird wrote to some of his business associates, which is pretty cool. He has a family Bible that has all the documentation of births and marriages and funerals, and some of this dates back to the late 1700s. But most importantly, my dad, he has this very real connection to his past. I mean, it's like these family members who have long been dead, he really knows. He gets where he comes from, and so he gets where I came from as well. His interest in genealogy then isn't just a mental exercise or kind of a side hobby. It shapes his self-understanding. And he often reminds me that had he known our family's history before I was born in 1970, you wouldn't be calling me Chad, you'd be calling me Mark Bird. I would have been, so to speak, the living image of our family's past reality. Well, maybe it was because I was raised in a family like that, where the past is present, where we know where we came from, we know our family's roots. Maybe because of that, my thinking and my teaching throughout the years has been founded on the conviction that we, as the family of God, we can never forget where we came from, our roots. Because remember, we believe in and we worship the Messiah, who is a Jew. He's a descendant of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Judah and David. He was circumcised according to the covenant. He was hailed as rabbi. He's a man whose identity and mission was formed and shaped by the history and the scriptures of Israel. And so Jesus says to the woman at the well, salvation is from where? Salvation is from the Jews. It's not from the Samaritans. It's not from the Greeks or the Romans or the Germans, or believe it or not, salvation is not even from the Texans. I have to include at least one Texas joke every presentation. Salvation is from the Jews. It's that olive tree into which we Gentiles have been grafted. It's the family into which we have been adopted. And so if salvation is from the Jews, then it goes without saying that the gospel is also from the Jews. And that means something very important. It means that the good news is also the oldest news. It's as old as the Gospel of Genesis with the skull-crushing seed of the woman. It's as old as the book of Exodus with the sacrificed and consumed Passover lamb. It's as old as the Gospel of Leviticus with the high priest splashing blood on the Ark of the Covenant. So on and on this goes, and every tiny piece of this is a bit of a jewel or a precious stone that forms part of this massive messianic mosaic that we call the Old Testament. In fact, I would argue that to miss the Old Testament, to miss the gospel in the Old Testament would be kind of like somebody reading through the whole Lord of the Rings and at the end not recalling any mention of Sam and Frodo. What I want to do for a few minutes is to try to un-Americanize and un-individualize and unmodernize our heads so that we kind of put a Hebrew brain inside our minds, or as they would say it, to put a Hebrew heart inside our chest. And crucial to this is the idea that when you unroll the scrolls of the Torah, what you're seeing is that the Lord who strolled through Eden, the Lord who boomed the 10 words down from Sinai, the Lord who visited the prophets, he is none other than the Son of God. It wasn't like Jesus was sitting in the dugout of heaven waiting for his turn at bat in the incarnation. He was in the game all along. He was always there. He was there in Egypt. He was there in the burning bush. He was there at the Red Sea. He was in the Holy of Holies. So on the top of every page of the Old Testament, you can write, this is about Jesus, the one who brings us salvation and the good news from the Jews for the entire world. Now, I want you to kind of picture the gospel by means of imagining a map, all right? And this map has 3 major locations: Egypt and the Red Sea and Jerusalem. Now, all three of these places, of course, are historical, but they're also archetypical. They describe kind of a core reality of what it means for us to be human. You can visit all 3 of them today, of course. You can stand in the shadow of the pyramids, and you can go through to splash in the water of the Red Sea, and you can visit the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. But here's the thing, you've also lived in all 3 of these places, even if you've never left the continental United States, because they're archetypical locations. They map our lives. They map from where God has taken us, through the place God has taken us, and to the location that God is bringing us to. And every single part of this, as they map our lives, it's a map of mercy. It's what you might call the cartography of grace. Let's start out with Egypt. There's been a mistake made on every single one of our birth certificates. Mine says that I was born in Jiao, New Mexico. True, but false. My wife says that she was born in Houston, Texas. Again, true, but false. We were all welcomed into this world with Egyptian sand blowing through the maternity ward. Pharaoh is our tyrant king, and we are all far, far from our true homeland. Beginning already with Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 12, and then continuing with the book of Exodus itself, and then on into prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea and Ezekiel, Egypt is this place of exile. It's a prison of exile. And so we all start our life behind Egyptian bars. The Bible, of course, describes the state of sin or unbelief in a lot of different ways. And we're probably more familiar with the New Testament language, maybe more comfortable with that, with being dead in trespasses and sins, or children of darkness, or enemies of God, and the like. And none of these, of course, would I ever deny or downplay. But what I think helps us is this distinctive way of thinking of how the Old Testament maps that life of unbelief. Because we are encouraged to think about our condition as being in this faraway country. We are searching. We are not at home. And this can be helpful for our understanding as well as for how we engage in evangelism and preaching. So what do I mean? Well, for one, to kind of riff off Augustine here, you could say that our hearts are homeless until they're at home with God in Zion. You've heard unbelievers talk this way. Every time that unbelievers talk about searching or feeling lost or trying to find their place in the world, they might not realize it, but they're actually speaking Egyptian. Theirs is a hieroglyphic kind of life, and their symbols may be Instagram posts or Facebook or Twitter laments that they carve onto their social media pyramids. But they're craving a place to belong. They miss what they've never known. They miss the city in which they've never actually lived, but to which God is calling them. That's what life is like in Egypt. And thinking of our life in sin or death as life in Egypt also helps to explain something that's come up a couple times today, and that is this feverish attempt to dress up the land of Egypt with the garments of Zion. And what I mean by this is the religionizing of everything. From the creeds of wokeness to the high priests of political parties to shopping malls being basically vast liturgical temples to a greater reverence for the national flag than for the cross of Jesus Christ. All of these are nothing but symptoms of people trying to scratch a religious itch that will not go away. Humans can no more stop being religious than we can stop being human. So Egypt is awash in religion, and every manifestation of this is people reaching out into the darkness toward the hand of an unknown God and grasping an idol by the tail. Living in Egypt as a way of describing life apart from God is actually just as much a part of the New Testament as well. It bleeds over into the New Testament. Just think of the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost or the prodigal son. Jesus is borrowing this Old Testament imagery. The faraway country of the prodigal is, in the Jewish imagination, the equivalent of Egypt. And here's something really fascinating. Remember on the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus and Moses and Elijah are talking, and what are they talking about? Well, Luke tells us they're talking about his exodus, which he's going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now think about that. The only place that an exodus is accomplished is in Egypt. So Jerusalem has become thoroughly Egyptianized in the first century. John says the same thing in Revelation 18, Revelation 11:8. Listen to this. He says, the great city that is symbolically called Sodom and Egypt, where the Lord was crucified. Egypt, where the Lord was crucified. So the whole of Passion Week is nothing more than Christ riding into an Egyptian Jerusalem, where he confronts the Pharaoh-like establishment of the day. And he endures 3 hours of darkness on the cross, like the 3 days of darkness in the 9th plague, which then leads into the 10th plague and the death of the Passover lamb, which in this case, his blood is not smeared on the doors of the Israelites, but on a Roman cross. And Christ does all this because there's no getting out of Egypt on your own. You think you're strong? Sin is stronger. You think you can kind of shimmy up this ladder of virtue to go over the walls of Egypt? It's going to collapse under the obesity of your own ego. There's no moralizing, there's no willing, there's no praying, there's no way out. We're like Israel. We're trapped. We're unable to liberate ourselves. There's only one way out, and that's by the one who comes in. You ever notice Jesus didn't send Moses to stand on the border of Egypt and to whistle for the Israelites to come on out and to liberate themselves? Moses didn't travel around Egypt with a Joel Osteen smile plastered across his face, giving inspirational speeches, just trying to whip the crowd into believing in themselves. No, Moses marched in, he spoke and did the Lord's word, and he marched out with Israel on his heels. Israel got out only because Moses came in. And we get out only because Jesus comes in. Now here's a little bit of Hebrew grammatical gospel for you, which is I know exactly why you all came out this afternoon. Over and over in the Torah, we encounter the verb yatzah, which means to go out. There's a particular Hebrew grammatical form called the hifil, which means to cause. So to cause to go out, to bring out, to make happen that someone exits. And this is used all over the Torah to describe how God brings, he yatzahs Israel out because they can't get out on their own. So the 10 commandments, the 10 words begin like this. I, the Lord your God, am the one who yatzah, who brought you forth from the land of Egypt. There's monergism for you, Hebrew style. Nobody voluntarily vacates the Egypt of sin and shame and death on their own. We are brought out, we are carried out by the God of mercy and grace. Now I could stop right there. Sit down, everybody say amen, and we would have an impressive Hebrew accented gospel. And in some cases, that's kind of the way that preaching goes. God saves you, period. Or you once were lost and now you're found, period. And that is very true. That glass of gospel is full to the top. But here's the way that God works. Every time that our glass of gospel is at the very top, God runs to the kitchen to get us a bigger glass. And when that glass is full, he runs to the kitchen and gets another glass and fills it up. In other words, our Lord is extravagant in his grace toward us. He's always finding new ways to map his mercy into our lives. And don't we see this in the life of Israel? You see, the Lord wasn't just content to get his people out of Egypt. It wasn't like he got Israel out of prison and he gave him a backpack full of clothes and a wad of cash and 2 packs of cigarettes and said, the bus station's that way to the promised land, have a nice trip. He wasn't content merely to get them out from slavery to freedom and then drop them off and so they could fend for themselves. He wanted to do more for them because God always wants to do more for us. So he staged this scenario at the Red Sea, which is probably one of the most famous rescue situations of all time. But I think maybe the full implications of what was going on at the Red Sea is easily missed if we kind of look at it just in isolation. So to get the Red Sea, what you need to do kind of a mental purge for me. You got to think differently about the way that you view oceans or seas, okay? So you got to purge your mind of the images that you might have of the ocean as you're standing on the deck of your cruise ship. You need to purge your mind of the image of the ocean you might have as you're there on the beach and you're hearing the gently lapping waves and you're sipping your pina colada or you're downing another cold one. Get rid of all those images. What I want you to think about when you think about the seas and the ocean in the Israelite imagination is you're trapped on a tiny boat and there's these freezing waves just cascading over you and there's chaos and confusion all around you. And as if that's not bad enough, there's a head of a dragon that's all of a sudden rising out of the ocean ready to devour you. That's kind of the image of the ocean in the Israelite imagination. So if you're an Israelite, land, good. Seas, bad. Why? Well, in a strange sort of way, it already begins kind of in the opening verses of Genesis. Remember Genesis 1:2. You all know this verse. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. I want you to understand a couple of things in this image. So, formless and void in Hebrew is tohu vavohu, and the deep is tehom, all right? So, tohu vavohu means that there's sort of there's no organization, there's no chaos, there's no kind of God-created divisions going on. It's all this kind of cosmic chaos mass of water. And because of that, it's kind of cool. Later prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, when they're describing how Israel departed from the orthodox worship of Yahweh and began to burn incense to Baal or to sacrifice their children to Moloch, this is described as Israel digressing into tohu vavohu again. Why? Because they're unworlding their world. They're entering into chaos and disorganization because they've abandoned the God of Israel. That's tohu vavohu. Now, the deep is fascinating. The deep in Hebrew is tehom, which is almost always in the Old Testament treated as a feminine proper name. So apologies to you ladies, but we're gonna call deep Mrs. Deep, okay? This is D with a capital D, a personified deep. The deep came to be treated as kind of a villainous woman who was out to kill you. The deep wasn't a place where you went scuba diving and you took these really cool videos of these weird looking fish and these rock formations. The deep getting a hold of you was like Thanos getting you in his grip, okay? So if you're an Israelite and you hear Genesis 1 read and you hear this language of tohu vavohu and tehom, of formlessness and void in the deep, you're hearing words that over time, these came to have a very negative connotation. So you don't take a family vacation in the deep. These are dangerous places from which God and God alone can deliver you. Now, why is that important? Well, you'll see in just a minute. Jump to what God did at the Red Sea. Exodus 14 gives us a pretty straightforward account of what happened. Israel's trapped on the shore of the Red Sea. They've got Pharaoh and his armies. They're greedily loping toward them. And so the Lord does what he does. He fights for his people, right? Well, how does he do this? He sends a strong east wind, and that east wind blows all through the night in the darkness. And then in the morning, you have dry land appearing so that Israel can pass from certain death to certain life. What we see happening at the Red Sea is Genesis 1 repeated. A new creation happens at the Red Sea. What happens at the beginning of creation? The Ruach of God, the Spirit of God, is hovering over the surface of the waters. At the Red Sea, this strong east Ruach, the strong east wind or breath of God is blowing over the waters. At creation, you have darkness over the surface of the deep. And at the Red Sea, you have darkness as the wind descends from God. And then in creation, you have the dry land appearing. And what happens at the Red Sea is the same thing. Same Hebrew word as well. Dry land appears so that his people can pass from death to life. God is using spirit and water and dry ground to bring about this gospel of recreation for his people. But there's more. That's the way that Exodus describes what happens. This is how Isaiah and the Psalms describe what happened. They don't give a blow-by-blow historical account of what happened at the Red Sea. Here's what they say. This is Isaiah 51, and he's picking up language from Genesis 1, and he's seasoning everything up with some mythological language. Isaiah says, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, of generations long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great Mrs. Deep, the great Tehom, Rahab, the dragon, Tehom?" All of these are mythological designations that the prophet was borrowing from his surrounding culture. Just like a preacher today might reference Star Wars or something from the Marvel movies, Isaiah does what the Psalms do. Listen to these two verses from the Psalms. "When the water saw you, O God, the deep," Mrs. Deep again, "trembled." Psalm 106, "God rebuked the Red Sea, it became dry, and he led them through Mrs. Tehom. He led them through the deep as through a desert." The name that Isaiah and the Psalms give to the Red Sea is the deep. This place of chaos and confusion and death. And what they're doing is actually fascinating because they're echoing what was already sung on the shores of the Red Sea back in Exodus chapter 15. This is the song that Moses taught the Israelites to sing. Toward the end of it, he says, "Pharaoh's chariots and his horse he has cast into the sea. The deep covered them." Plural, the deeps covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. So God brought the enemies of Israel into the deep, and there he destroyed them. And notice something very important. Not one of them survived. Exodus 14:29. "All the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained." And you know what this means? This means that when God saves his people, he never saves his people half-ass. And when God destroys the enemies, he never destroys the enemy half-ass. It's a complete redemption. It's a complete destruction. Because when God saves us, and when God destroys sin and death and the devil and all of our enemies, he doesn't do this 99%. He does it in totality. And we don't have time to look at all the other occurrences in the Old Testament where seas and oceans are kind of these personifications of chaos and death and demonic forces, but you get the point. Just think of Noah's flood, where all of creation becomes this vast, watery graveyard of rebellious humanity. Think of Jonah, who's cast into the watery deep. And now jump ahead into the New Testament, and you find the same thing happening. When Jesus was walking upon the waters in the midst of the storm, Dan talked about this last night, when Peter got out of the boat. When Jesus is doing this, what he's doing, he's walking upon the surface of Tehom. He's walking upon the surface of the deep. And his disciples are trapped in the boat. So what is Jesus doing? He's going retro. Jesus is going Genesis 1, he's going Red Sea all over again. And he who is the creative word of God, who in Genesis 1 said, "Let there be," now says, "Hush, be still." And the waves and the sea obey him. This also explains this enigmatic verse in Revelation 21 where John describes a new creation and he says, there's one thing that is no longer there. There's no longer any sea, because Mrs. Tahome is banned from the new creation. Now, you might be saying to yourself, that's some really cool kind of Old Testament theological background, but what does this have to do with us? Well, it has everything to do with us. What I've just given to you is this entire liquid gospel background that all comes to its climax for us when God uses water and the Spirit to bring about a new creation for us in our baptisms. Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, which itself is a kind of mini Red Sea. The Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground just like they'd crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. Peter speaks of baptism as the corresponding reality, in Greek, the antitupos, the antitype to the flood. Paul wants to make sure that we marry the Red Sea to baptism when he says to the Corinthians that all the Israelites were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. He could have said they were all led by Moses, but he chose that language so we make the connection between this national baptism of Israel and our own baptisms. So, if we draw on all this Old Testament imagery and theology, we could say that part of the Old Testament gospel is preparing us for baptism, which is nothing more than God plunging us into the waters of the deep where we die with the likes of Pharaoh and his army. God is casting us into the waters of the flood where we die with the world. God, in other words, is uniting us to death, but not death generically, the death of Christ, where all sin and all evil and all death was buried precisely so that we can emerge into the new creation, onto the other side of the Red Sea, into the ark of life by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In these waters, we die and rise. We are crucified and buried and raised with Jesus, and we walk on dry land astride the shoulders of Jesus to the Easter side of the Red Sea. Okay, now as we shift our focus from from Egypt and the Red Sea to the third place on the map, to the city of Jerusalem, we're kind of in for a challenge as modern believers. In fact, I would argue it's the same challenge that's faced Christians since the 2nd century. Things get a little tricky here because in Jerusalem, we have a lot of things that come together we don't typically lump as gospel sort of things. So that's the ordinary Christian, and they don't really think of things like temple and priesthood and a whole lot of dead cows and sheep and things you can and can't eat and holy ground. They don't think of these as any way connected to the gospel. They're weird, they're foreign, perhaps they're even kind of off-putting or disgusting to us. They certainly don't come to the forefront of our minds if we think about what the gospel is. But I would argue that when it comes to Jerusalem and everything that Jerusalem represents, the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices, that we're looking at a perfect expression of what Christ gives to us in his gospel. I'd summarize it like this. Jerusalem, with its temple and priesthood and sacrifices, typifies our arrival back in Eden as priests who serve in the kingdom of God. Let me explain what I mean. Let's work our way from the book of Hebrews backward. So if you're familiar with kind of the argument of Hebrews, the author is proving the superiority of Jesus to the angels, to the old covenant, to the old priesthood, to the old tabernacle. And when he's done all that in the first 9 chapters, he gets to the 10th chapter and he says these words. And he's speaking to the people to whom he's writing. And he's also speaking to all of us. He's speaking to the Christian church. And here's what he says. You have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. He doesn't say you will come. He says in Greek, pros eleleuthate, which is the perfect tense of that verb. You have already come. You have arrived at Mount Zion, the heavenly city, the heavenly Jerusalem. How so? Let's begin by thinking or rethinking about when the Exodus itself was over. want you to recalibrate the end of the Exodus. We ordinarily think of the Exodus as ending when Joshua leads the Israelites across the Jordan River and they enter into the promised land, and so the Exodus is over. Well, not really. The Exodus doesn't end when Israel enters the promised land. Listen to these two verses. One is from Exodus 15, the Song at the Sea, and one is from 1 Kings chapter 6. At the Red Sea, Israel sang this: "You, O God, will bring your people in and plant them on your own mountain, the place which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary." So in this Song at the Sea, which is a future prophetic song depicting the history of Israel, it doesn't just take them out of the sea and into the wilderness. The song takes them all the way to the mountain where God will establish his sanctuary. That's in Exodus. 1 Kings chapter 6 says this: "In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt," 480 years after they came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, he began to build the house of the Lord. The dating of the temple's construction is based upon the Exodus. Why? Because the temple's construction finally signals the Exodus's completion. The journey that began in water ends on a mountaintop. The Exodus isn't over until the temple is built. Then you can write the end. Now, why exactly on a mountaintop? Or more specifically, why was this temple on the mountaintop? Because the temple was for the Israelites the Garden of Eden 2.0. The sanctuary was decorated all over with these images that made it look like a garden sanctuary, images of all sorts of plants, images of oxen and lions, images of angels. So this was like a garden paradise. The menorah inside the Holy of Holies was like a new tree of life with branches whose fruit is light to lighten, to illumine the holy place. The two Hebrew verbs used to describe the duties of Adam, avad and shamar, to serve and to guard, those two verbs are used over and over in the Torah to describe the duties of the priest in the sanctuary. They're to serve and they're to guard, because each priest is an Adam, serving and guarding the temple where God dwells with his people. And here's something else. The temple is located on a mountain, and appropriately so, because so was Eden. Usually when we think about Eden, we think about it just kind of being in the east, which is the way Genesis describes it. But in later biblical writings, Eden is elevated to where it's on a mountaintop. Ezekiel says that the Eden, the garden of God, is the holy mountain of God. And Ezekiel also locates his end-time temple on this, where, with the water of life coming from it. He locates that on a mountaintop. So when you think about Eden, you're thinking about Mount Eden. And so when the temple is built, this replacement Eden, it's perfectly positioned on a mountaintop. Here's the mountain paradise. Here's the place where God dwells among his people to welcome their sacrifices. This is the place where he forgives them and cleanses them. He sanctifies them by bestowing upon them his gift of holiness. The people of Israel were kind of like rebellious Adam and Eve. They were living in exile in Egypt, and they were brought through the Red Sea, and they were finally brought home to Mount Eden, where the temple was built, where they could be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. Now, with all of that said, let's circle back to what we heard from Hebrews chapter 10. Because Christ has come as our new and better high priest. Because Christ has offered a better sacrifice in his own flesh and blood. Because Christ has fulfilled the old covenant, given us a new and a better covenant. Because he's passed through the heavenly tabernacle. Because all of this is true, we now have confidence to enter the Holy of Holies. And because of that, you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. Now, what does that look like? What does it look like for us to come to Mount Zion? It looks like the communal life as the people of God, his priesthood. We're gathered around his word, his baptism, his meal. We're gathered as we are today as brothers and sisters in Christ, joined as one mystical body. And what's Christ doing when he gathers us around himself? He's sanctifying us. Now, contrary to what you may have heard, sanctification is a word that is simply saturated and dripping with gospel. Sanctify means to make holy. And the only one who's capable of making us holy is the one of whom the angels sang, holy, holy, holy in the vision of Isaiah. So when Christ makes us members of his body, the new temple, he cleanses us inside and out with the blood of his sacrifice. And when he makes us co-priests along with him, what is he doing but sharing his holiness with us? This has nothing to do with morality. And it certainly has nothing to do with us making ourselves holy. Self-sanctification is just as impossible as self-deification is. When Christ makes us holy, he is giving us himself. He's gifting us with himself, who is holiness. So how do we wrap all this up? Well, if I were to ask a person who's schooled in the New Testament, what would you kind of summarize as the gospel? Maybe they point to John 3:16. Or maybe the verse over here, Ephesians 2:8-9, for by grace you have been saved through faith. Here's how I would summarize the gospel in the Old Testament. The incarnate Yahweh, Jesus Christ, has carried us out of Egyptian bondage through the baptismal death and resurrection of the Red Sea, all the way to Mount Zion, the New Eden, where we bask in the grace of his life-giving holiness as members of the royal priesthood. Beginning, I talked about us being part of the family of God and knowing where we came from. Well, that's where we came. That's where the gospel comes from. This is the good news of the God who, from Genesis onward, is God of grace and mercy, who does for us what we cannot do, who bestows upon us the liquid of life, who fills us with his life-giving holiness so that we can stand in his presence as those who are forgiven and redeemed and free. This is his map of mercy. This is his cartography of grace. Thank you.